I am live. I'm reading Prelude to the Landing on Planet Earth. It is a book about a journey through the Middle East, published 1977 by STUART HOLROYD. And it is a journey to prevent war, guided by the extraterrestrials. Tom is the speaker. We are now in the chapter entitled Ambassadors Extraordinary, which is chapter 6, and I stopped here that Tom had advised them that should remain together at all times and be careful what they say in public places, but they would be able to talk freely in the hotel room. Meanwhile, they could continue their good work of diffusing the explosive political situation. On the present state of play in the war game, Tom reported, Soviet Russia has not bowed to your nation, Doctor. They will go to a point, but not beyond that point, and at this time they are considering the possibility of doing it themselves and saying that your nation has done it. It is important that the power that the three of you generate negates the Soviet Russia's thinking. It is also of the utmost importance that you be in Israel, not later than the 24th of your November. Andrija asked what they would be able to do in Israel, since it seemed that all the important decisions were being made elsewhere, and Tom answered, "It is through your energy that the leaders of Israel will be given the strength to make the proper decisions and proper negotiations without giving their souls." The plan to interrupt television and radio transmissions during the period of the 18th to the 22nd of November was still on, they learned, and would be carried out whatever the international situation was at the time. Speaking for the civilization that is handling that project, Tom said, that it may not be with the fullest of force, but it will be the beginning. Also, it might afford an opportunity to alert people of the world to what their governments had in mind. We are already, in effect, overriding at this time with experiments, he told them, as if to demonstrate the fact. Andrija's radio, which throughout the communication had remained tuned and silent on the specified frequency, began just as the session was coming to a close, to emit curious noises, a cacophony of sounds, made by musical instruments with the cornet predominant. "Is that Ultima's sound?" John asked. "Yes, they are testing," Tom said, "and to listen to the tape today and hear that pat response makes one ask the question, is he truth-teller or opportunist? The sounds are certainly unlike anything one would expect to hear on a radio, even in the Middle East. Rather like a brass band frenziedly tuning up in the middle of a battlefield. But to paraphrase Shakespeare's Prospero, the air is full of noises, and as Coué demonstrated, men are infinitely suggestible. The extra day in Ankara afforded John and Andrija the leisure and opportunity to take a long look at certain problems that they felt were undermining their efficiency in the work. In the second Ankara session, they discussed these problems with Tom, and the discussion, which lasted an hour, is interesting, both as evidence of Tom's insight and for the light it throws on the relationship and interpersonal problems of Phyllis, Andrija, and John at this time. I will have to summarize it briefly in the present context, and such a summary will not convey so strongly as does listening to the tape of the discussion, with all its give and take and repetitions, the impressive way that Tom, by means of Socratic questioning and analysis, obliged John and Andrija fundamentally to change their view of the situation. The situation, as they at first saw it, was that Phyllis was causing them problems by being moody and sometimes apparently reluctant to work, and as she had told Andrija some days ago, that she was lonely, he suggested that things might be better if she had her husband with her. This is not true, Tom said, but Andrija argued that it must be because Phyllis herself had said that she was lonely. You understand not, Tom said categorically. So John had a go and explained that recently Phyllis had come to need much more attention than formerly. She was like a child, and when it came to work she was always finding reasons to postpone it, or to do it in a different way. We are reading into the situation things that are not there, Tom said. Look within your own hearts, the two of you. Andrija didn't admit it, that he had the same problem to an extent and would feel better if he had an emotional companion on these trips. And he asked if it might not help alleviate some of their interpersonal strains and tensions if they travelled with such companions. Tom professed not to understand the question, and Andrija had to spell it out in different terms before Tom said he would consult. While he was consulting, John told Andrija that he didn't feel quite the same as he did about it, and Andrija said, I don't particularly need to know what, but there is this emotional thing in the air all the time. And when Tom, having consulted, asked how they thought the presence of others would affect the work, he repeated that he thought it would help by preventing ridiculous emotional problems arising all the time. Whose are the emotional problems? Tom said. Well, both John and I feel that it's the being, Phyllis. In what manner? She's lonely. She says so. You are creating the problem. You understand not. I'm sorry, but you're wrong. She told me herself that that's her problem. She gets upset because of being lonely and takes it out in little ways on us. And you have no knowledge of doing the same? Andrija was becoming exasperated. He said, I don't feel lonely. That's not my problem. And I think we're getting into an impasse here that isn't very elevated. You are correct, Tom said calmly, but you do not understand. I don't think you're trying to understand us, and I don't know why. We understand what is inside. Now, would you speak, Sir John? After this exchange, in which Andrija's exasperation came close to turning to anger, John tried to be conciliatory and reasonable. He said that part of Phyllis' problem was probably that he and Andrija didn't give her all the support they could, and that they could try to help in future by being closer and more supportive. But Tom wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted them to examine the question whether the central problem really was Phyllis's loneliness. With regard to the work, Andrija said, he felt that the problem was her lack of enthusiasm and unwillingness to accept all the responsibilities the work entailed. For instance, when they tried to play her the tapes of the communications, her mind tended to wander as if she didn't really want to face what the tapes said. John supported this interpretation, saying, yes, there is this reluctance. She says she will always work, but many times she's rather morose before she does, and I don't understand that. You don't understand. You understand not communication, Tom said bluntly. The doctor should. Had she, he asked, ever refused to work or to go somewhere required by the work? They had to admit that she had actually never refused. And do you understand that it is important for many things not to be in the mind of the being? He said, implying that this was the reason for Phyllis's unwillingness to listen attentively to the tapes. This, too, they had to admit. So, what was the problem? I think it is the situation of the relationship between the three of us that is the problem, John said. There have been times, Doctor, when you have involved yourself and have created problems, and we have not chastised you for that. Andrija and then John in turn had to admit that this was true. Tom proceeded to demolish the theory that the root cause of the problem was a lack of emotional companionship, forcing them to contemplate that what it would be like if their respective partners were with them on this trip, and to admit that in that situation there would be nothing but trouble. Then he said, may we bring into the open what is the core of the problem? I wish you would, said Andrija. The one who is most unbalanced is the one who is the balance. Sir John, have you looked within? Have you understood that it is your frustration that have created the problem? Suddenly transported as if it were from the jury box to the dock, John was defenseless. He listened as Tom gave example from his recent conduct of how he frequently got frustrated because the others, Andrija as well as Phyllis, did not do things as he thought they should be done, or at the time he wanted them to be done, and of how these frustrations built up into resentment, which Phyllis felt and was affected by. There was nothing that John could deny or defend. He was chastened. He could only say, "I'm sorry, but I think you know that my motivation is that I'm trying always to do the right thing, to help the work." "You are not the only one who is trying," Tom persisted. "All three are trying, and all three have frustrations, and no one is better than another. You say you must treat the being as a child, but part of the reason you have a problem is because you treat her as a child. You must treat each other as equals, not even as man or woman, because this is not the nature of the three of you. Do you understand?" "Yes, I do," John said, and he thanked Tom for his insight and his counsel. "There are things that are going to be very difficult in the next 2 years," Tom said in conclusion. "And if you cannot deal with this, how will you deal with those?" Andrija said that he was sure that with Tom's continuing help and guidance, they would be able to deal with their interpersonal problems and maintain the harmonious balance of the triangle, which they all understood was essential to the work. In spite of their problems and very human failings, they were, according to Tom, succeeding in their apparent superhuman mission. En route from Ankara to Tehran, they unobtrusively held their meditation session in the transit lounge at Beirut airport, and in the next communication they held, Tom told them, "What we have asked you to do, you have done, and let us assure you that though you may not see or feel or think that there are any effects, there truly are. Because you see, not a tangible result, you understand not." They had succeeded in preventing a Russian-American conspiracy, but they had still to negate the Soviet Russians of their intent. Their influence was working to that effect, and from their present situation it was also spreading to the south and west, and affecting the Arab leaders. Moreover, a little influence in Iran itself was not going to go amiss, for the country was going to play an increasingly important part as a balancing influence in the Middle East in the future. The Shah of Iran, Tom predicted, will become a strong and very important spokesman in deterring, though not at this time. They spent 2 nights in Tehran before setting out on the last leg of their journey, which would take them to Copenhagen via Moscow. They had not had time to obtain visas for Russia before leaving New York, but Tom stressed that it was important that they should at least pass through the Russian capital. So they had scheduled the journey so that they had 4 hours in Moscow airport in transit. There were only 4 or 5 passengers on the Iran Air Boeing 707 from Tehran to Moscow, so Andrija conceived the idea of taking the opportunity of the relative privacy to attempt to hold a communication. They waited until they had seen Mount Arafat on the left side of the plane, and they were flying at 35,000 feet above southern Russia when they established contact with Tom. "We wish to speak in another language," was the first thing he said, and proceeded to utter a few phrases of musical chanting. He then explained, "You're close to your homeland, and we wish that all adjustments were in order so we could speak to you in the original." Recalling the earlier occasion when they had heard that chanting language, Andrija understood that by his homeland Tom meant the Tarim Basin, and he asked if he could now tell them more about the civilization of Aksu. "Doctor, you were one of the founders," Tom answered, "and you are now coming full circle. You are now one of the savers. Remember, Sir John, that you carried on the thoughts and service of the founders, as this being did at a later date. As conditions were not favorable for a prolonged communication, Tom changed the subject, giving them instructions as to what they should do in Moscow. He concluded with a shrewd comments on the Russian mind that I quoted in chapter 1, see page 13. Then Phyllis came out of trance and described a place she had visited during her trance. There was something in the clay there that made it shine, and there were all kinds of bird symbols of some sort, all kinds of birds. The singing, it was fantastic. I can't describe it. It was like talking in levels, and there were hundreds of people, and they were singing, and it was like they were singing in a hosanna. It was beautiful. In earlier communications, John and Andrija had learned that the original language of Aksu was a tonal language, which would sound like singing, and that the predominant symbology of the civilization had featured birds. So Phyllis's description was consistent, both with this earlier information and with the content of the communication that it followed. Arriving in Moscow, they tried to get a special dispensation to tour the city in the company of an in-tourist guide, but were refused. They had to spend the hours between flights in the transit lounge and do their meditation there. They found a quiet corner of the cafeteria, and as they were undisturbed, John suggested, when they had completed, that they might attempt a second communication of the day under unusual circumstances. So as not to be too conspicuous, they did not record this session, which was a short one, but later in the day they recorded the fact that it had contained one thing of significance. Tom had said that there was an assassination plot underway aimed at the PLO leader Yasser Arafat, and that they should meditate at 3 o'clock New York time in order to prevent it. The prescribed time fitted well into their day's schedule, for it fell shortly after they had settled into their hotel in Copenhagen in the evening. Shortly afterwards, they held another communication and obtained a longer explanation of the Arafat situation. Tom informed them. A meeting was arranged for the leader Arafat to view installations of a military nature. There were to be journalists of different nations, and the plan was to have a conference, and when the photographs were to be taken, this would be the time. The conference is still in progress. There are 2 that have been pulled out because of previous knowledge, and that in effect is what you have done. This is the kind of information that should be checkable if one had access to the relevant records. From the newspapers, all I have been able to ascertain is that Yasser Arafat was in Cuba on this day, 15th November. He had been in the news all the week because 2 days before he had made a speech to the United Nations Assembly in New York in which he had accused Israel of preparing for a 5th war in the Middle East. On the 14th of November he had flown to Cuba to spend 2 or 3 days, and it is certainly likely that his program there would have included a press conference and a viewing of military installations, as Tom said. Reviewing the past week, Tom went on to say, "Your project has been successful. The Russians are no longer inclined to become involved. They have become more stable, and truly now, because of your trip, they are considering going forward with their own nation and the nations they control. There have been leadership problems, but they are stabilizing, and they have also realized that they may be the goat. They like to be the bear, and they would not like to be the goat." The journey had also been a learning experience for the 3 of them. In reviewing the past 8 of your days, you will find that, besides the work which you have accomplished, there have been many things within you which you have mastered. And they had learned about the energy that they could channel, and how doubts and negative thoughts could undermine a project. This was a thing they should never forget, and in the coming months they were going to have many demonstrations of the effects of their positive thinking. There was still a need for them to be in Israel the following week, because by being in that area you will not only stabilize the leaders of Israel, but also put a damper on the other leaders. But during the following week they should be, as originally planned, back at Ossining for the experiments in television intervention. It was early on Sunday morning, the 17th November, that John, Andrija and Phyllis arrived back in Ossining. They did not see the following day's issue of the London Times, though they would have been amused and perhaps gratified if they had, for it carried on the front line the headline, on the front page the headline, "Threat of a new Middle East war recedes." On the face of it, the idea of communicating to the people of the world by using their radio and television networks would appear a most efficient way for an extraterrestrial civilization to get its message across. Being capable of interstellar travel should not, we imagine, have any difficulty with the technology such an intervention would require. This, however, may be an unwarranted assumption, because we can form no conception of either technology. We cannot assume that command over the one must imply an equal facility in the other. That would be illogical. But because men are often illogical, particularly with regard to matters in which they have invested faith, love or money, and it is understandable that after all that had happened in the past weeks, Andrija and John were eager to have some visible and irrefutable evidence of the reality of the intelligences and the forces that they were trafficking with. Tom had cautioned them about expecting too much. Ultima says you think he is what in your world you call a magician. He is a refined technician and he is a perfectionist, but he is not a magician and he does not want to blow out the being. Nevertheless, they returned to Ossining expecting something like a miracle. When they were in Ankara, Tom had told them that the communications transmissions project could not be initiated with the fullest of force. Andrija took up the point a couple of days later in Tehran and asked, "Is it not possible somehow to make a stronger showing during our communications initiation on the 18th to 22nd of November, in such a way that men's mind will be taken off war and will begin seriously to wonder about your presence and possible coming to Earth?" Tom answered, "We understand what you are speaking about and we wish we could help. We wish there was the power to help. Remember that when we sent you Yuri, this was a primitive power and a power that could do many things. But then there was the problem with Yuri. Then we sent you Bobby, and we had the same difficulty, and so this being and the two of you were willing to be used. But the work that had been done on this being for many years was not in the field of what we are now attempting to do. This, you must understand, is a different power from that power we originally planned. We can put power through this being of that nature, but it could create a problem for the physical body to the extent that we would no longer have a being." The point behind this, and behind the earlier mention of the danger of a blowout, is that Phyllis was to function as the main channel for the energies required for the communications transmission. When transmission was being attempted, she was to sit in the Faraday cage, wired up to Andreja's electronic equipment, and all three of them were to meditate in order to focus the required energy. They did this 3 times daily for the 4 days, 19th to the 22nd of November inclusive, and all the time Andrija kept his radio tuned and connected to the tape recorder, so that if anything could come through, they would have a record of it. Nothing did. On the 21st of November, they had the television programs on Channel 9 and 3 videotaped between 2:30 and 3:30 in the afternoon, because they had been told that an attempt would be made to communicate on those channels at that time. But again, nothing happened. It seemed that the entire project had been a failure, and at the end of the period Tom admitted that it had been in most areas. But, nevertheless, Ultima was satisfied because the experiment had been successful in 27% of the area in which it had been attempted, and only regretted that these didn't include the areas monitored by the group in Ossining. He says that you, as a scientist, will understand, Tom reported to Andrija, adding that after this moderately successful first attempt, Ultima and his unit would continue working at the technical difficulties. Even in the areas where intervention had been successful, they had not succeeded in creating any effect that would start people asking questions. They had accomplished only short blackouts and faint superimpositions of images alien to the program, irregularities that viewers would shrug off to a technical fault. Ultima clearly had a great deal to learn before this technology awakened the world to his and his colleagues' existence. The project had first been mentioned in the course of the communications held in the Bahamas in June, and since then Andrija and John had built up great expectations around it, and though Tom had on several occasions told them about the problem involved and how Phyllis was really too sensitive a channel for the rather primitive energies that the project necessitated, that they were disappointed that the results of the 18 to 20 November series of experiments were not more positive and evidential. One of the sessions held over these 4 days consisted of an hour-long and very impressive lecture that Tom addressed to his terrestrial colleagues. The 9, he said, were disturbed by certain directions that their conduct and their thoughts were asking, and it was necessary to repeat and clarify a few points. We have told you before that zeal is futile. It is of great importance that this be understood, and especially by you, Sir John. And it is of importance, and we speak to the 3 of you now, that you do not think of yourselves as special. You have a special function, but it does not relieve you of the problem of the physical plane or give you a special dispensation to remove yourself from the affairs of the physical world. Your purpose is to help the physical world, and for that you must exist on the physical planet. What we have asked of you is that you balance it. There is no way you can help people if you understand them not. If you understand not the joys, the fears, the sadness, the despair, the loves and the angers of people that exist in the physical world. In truth, you are to master these things, but a person does not master them by escaping from them. A person mastered them by existing among them. If you remove yourself from the physical world, you have no temptation, you have no anger, you have no joy, you have no love, and by removing, yes, you can master these things, because there is no temptation, and there is no touching of other beings. The most important of all is ego that must be dealt with, and all 3 have difficulties with that. Remember this, for the 3 of you to come as far as you have, it was important to have an ego, and it is still important. We do not ask you to be egoless, because if you were, you would not have character. You would not have character. But it is important to be balanced and to exist in the world and to realize that you are not more important than any other. None of you is a perfect thing. is a perfect being, but each of you has qualities that blended together makes a perfect being. And when you understand not each other, how can you understand the world that you are trying to raise the consciousness of? Remember, you cannot escape your destiny if you can only turn around and walk towards it. And the destiny of the three of you is to be involved with the peoples of the world to help them. So I make here a break. Did I say it is the 4th of March 2025?